Unlock the door to mystery with one very short story. The micro-podcast filled with morally complex characters, twists you won't predict, and endings you won't forget. Every episode is a brief, intense journey, perfect for listeners who crave mystery, intrigue, and stories that leave you thinking long after the tale ends. Today's episode begins now. The jury. Frank Torrino's pen clicked against the table. Third time in 2 minutes. The sound cut through the stale air of jury room B like a blade through wet cardboard. He adjusted the small, flesh-colored device in his left ear. The one that looked like a hearing aid, but was feeding him information from the federal task force listening 3 floors below. We've been over this. Juror number 4 rubbed her temples, dark circles under her eyes, coffee breath and desperation. The defendant was there. His prints were on the gun. Case closed. Nothing's ever that clean. Frank set the pen down, studied the faces around the scarred oak table. 12 people who'd rather be anywhere else. 12 people who'd drawn the short straw of civic duty. 12 people who had no idea they'd been playing a rigged game from the start. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Harsh, unforgiving. The kind of light that made everyone look guilty of something, which, in this room, they were. Look, we all want to go home. Juror number 7 loosened his tie, sweat stains under his arms despite the air conditioning. Kid's guilty. Let's vote and get out of here. Frank watched him. Really watched. The way his hands shook when he reached for his water cup. The way his eyes darted to the evidence photos, then away, like they burned to look at. The voice in his earpiece whispered details about Paul Morrison, age 42, witnessed the murder but took money to stay quiet. What's your hurry, Pete? It's not Pete. It's Paul. Right. Paul. Frank leaned back in his chair. The metal groaned. You seem eager to wrap this up. We all are. But Paul's voice cracked on the last word. The case was simple enough on paper. Marcus Webb, 28, shot dead outside his apartment building. Single bullet to the chest. The defendant, Tommy Castellano, found 3 blocks away with the murder weapon, open and shut. Except nothing about this case was real. The courtroom upstairs was a stage. The judge was a federal agent. The lawyers were undercover operatives. Even Tommy Castellano was playing a role, though the 11 other people in this room didn't know that. They thought they were deciding a man's fate. Instead, they were about to seal their own. Frank had spent 40 years reading people. First as a beat cop, then as a detective. Finally, as the lead investigator for a joint federal task force targeting organized crime. And these 11 people around the table? They were all part of the criminal network that had been bleeding the city dry for years. Let's go through it again. Frank pulled the evidence folder toward him. The voice in his ear fed him details. Marcus Webb, 28 years old, worked construction. No criminal record. We know all this. Juror number 3 shifted in his seat. Expensive suit, manicured nails, the kind of guy who'd never worked construction a day in his life. Can we just vote? What's your name again? Richard Moss. Frank made a note. The earpiece crackled softly. Richard Moss, construction company owner, safety violations, bribes to city inspectors. The real Marcus Webb had been about to expose him before he disappeared. Not dead, in witness protection. You seem familiar, Richard. We met before. I don't think so. But Richard's jaw tightened. A tell Frank had seen 1,000 times. The micro-expression of a man caught in a lie. Funny thing about this case. Frank spread the crime scene photos across the table. Blood on concrete. Chalk outline. The usual dance of death. All of it staged by the FBI's crime scene unit. Victim had no enemies, no debts, no reason for anyone to want him dead. Except the defendant. Juror number 9 spoke for the first time in an hour. Attractive woman, mid-40s, wedding ring that caught the light when she moved her hands. Tommy Castellano had motive. Frank's earpiece whispered her real name. Maria Santos. Not married, the ring was cover. She'd been Marcus Webb's contact inside the construction company, feeding him information about safety violations and worker deaths that got covered up. Did he? Frank looked at her. What motive was that? She hesitated. The prosecution said a lot of things. Doesn't make them true. Frank had been part of planning this operation for 18 months. Every detail choreographed, every piece of evidence crafted, every juror selected because they were connected to the criminal network they were trying to dismantle. The fake trial was just the final act. Marcus Webb was clean, Frank continued. No gambling debts, no drug connections, no angry ex-girlfriends, so why's he dead? Random crime. Juror number 11 spoke up. Nervous energy. Kept checking his phone even though they weren't supposed to have them. Happens all the time. The voice in Frank's ear identified him. Vincent Caruso, enforcer for the Torrino crime family. No relation to Frank, despite the name. Vincent had been the one who'd actually killed 3 construction workers who'd tried to report safety violations. Made it look like accidents. Nothing random about a single shot to the heart. That's personal. That's someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The room fell quiet except for the hum of the lights and the distant sound of traffic. Frank let the silence stretch, watched faces, counted heartbeats in the pulse points of necks. In his ear, Agent Rodriguez was coordinating the takedown teams positioned throughout the building. I think we should take another vote. Juror number 2 was older, gray-haired, reminded Frank of his father. See where we stand. William Torres, the man who'd been running the whole operation, the one they'd been hunting for 5 years, sitting right across from Frank, pretending to be a retired accountant called for jury duty. We just voted an hour ago. Frank didn't look away from Richard Moss. 11 guilty, 1 not guilty. That was me, in case anyone's keeping score. So, change your vote. Paul's voice had an edge now, desperation bleeding through. Kid's guilty. We all know it. Do we? Frank touched his ear, adjusting the device. To anyone watching, it looked like he was having trouble with his hearing aid. The gesture was a signal. Phase 2 was beginning. You know, I've been thinking about this case all wrong. Frank opened his notebook, started reading from notes that had been prepared months ago. Marcus Webb, born in Queens, moved to the city 5 years ago, worked for Moss Construction. Richard went pale. That's your company, isn't it, Richard? I own several construction companies. But Moss Construction was the one Marcus worked for, right up until he started asking questions about why so many workers were getting hurt. I don't remember every employee. You remember the ones who threaten to go to the authorities about safety violations, the ones who start documenting which buildings are using substandard concrete, The ones who figure out that someone's been cutting corners and people are dying because of it. The silence in the room changed, became heavier, more dangerous. That's not, Richard started. Marcus Webb wasn't just a construction worker. He was documenting everything, taking photos, recording conversations, building a case that would have brought down your entire operation. You can't prove that. Don't have to. He already did. Frank turned to Paul. You were there that night, weren't you? I don't know what you're talking about. Outside Marcus's apartment, you saw what happened. Paul's hands were shaking openly now. I was home, with my wife. Your wife who left you 6 months ago. The one who couldn't stand that you'd started taking money to look the other way when people got hurt? The room was a powder keg now. Frank could feel it. The tension crackling like electricity before a storm. In his earpiece, he heard Agent Rodriguez confirm that all exits were sealed. You didn't just see what happened to Marcus, Frank pressed. You were supposed to make sure he never made it home that night. I never hurt anyone. No, but you made the call. Told them when he'd be walking home. Told them which route he always took. Paul stood up so fast his chair fell over. You don't know what you're talking about. Sit down, Paul. No, I'm done with this. Sit down. Something in Frank's voice made Paul freeze. The voice of a man who'd faced down armed suspects in dark alleys, who'd talked jumpers off bridges and killers into confessions, who'd spent 2 years undercover in the Torrino crime family before this operation began. Paul sat. Frank turned to Maria Santos. What's your real name? Sarah. Sarah Chen. Frank's earpiece crackled with correction. The task force had decided to let her keep using the alias she'd been living under. Maria Santos had been dead for 3 years, killed when she tried to leave the organization. Sarah Chen had taken her identity to stay alive. You knew Marcus, didn't you, Sarah? Her wedding ring caught the light again as her hand trembled. I've never seen him before in my life. Funny, because you were the one feeding him information. You were his inside source at the construction company. Sarah's face crumbled. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. How was it supposed to happen? Marcus was going to gather enough evidence to bring them all down. We were going to go to the FBI together. But then Richard found out, and he said, Sarah, shut up. Richard's voice was ice. Richard said what? Frank leaned forward. He said Marcus was going to ruin everything, that he had to be stopped. But I thought he just meant fired, or maybe scared off. I didn't know they were going to... Going to what? Kill him. So you helped set him up? No, I told them where he'd be that night. I thought they were going to talk to him. Maybe offer him money to keep quiet. Frank looked around the table. 11 faces staring back at him. 11 people who'd thought they were safe, who'd thought their secrets would stay buried, who had no idea that Marcus Webb was alive and well, living under a new identity in Oregon, and that his testimony had already been recorded. Let me tell you how this really worked. Frank's voice was conversational now, almost friendly. Richard needed Marcus silenced, but he couldn't do it himself. Too obvious. So he reached out to his contacts in organized crime. He turned to Vincent Caruso. That's where you come in, isn't it, Vincent? You were supposed to make Marcus disappear. Make it look like an accident, like all the others. Vincent was sweating bullets now. I never killed anyone. No? What about Joey Martinez? Fell off a scaffold last year, except the safety harness had been cut. That was an accident. What about Danny O'Brien? Crushed by a crane, except someone had tampered with the hydraulics. You can't prove any of this. What about Lisa Park? Electrocuted when she touched a wire that should have been grounded, except someone had removed the ground wire. Vincent's face was white now. Those were accidents, all of them. 3 construction workers, all working on Moss construction sites, all about to file complaints with OSHA, all dead within 6 months of each other. Frank stood up, walked to the window, looked down at the street below. Federal agents in unmarked cars, SWAT teams in position, the culmination of 2 years of undercover work. But Marcus Webb was different. Marcus was smart. He knew someone was targeting whistleblowers, so he went underground, started working with law enforcement. He turned back to the table, studied each face, looking for the moment when they realized the trap they'd walked into. His eyes settled on William Torres, the older man who'd been running the whole operation. What's your real name, William? William Torres, same as I told you. No, you're Antonio Torrino, head of the Torrino crime family, the man who's been ordering these killings. The man's expression didn't change. You're confused, Frank. But around the table, the atmosphere shifted. Richard Moss went rigid in his chair. Paul Morrison's eyes darted toward the door. Sarah Chen stopped crying and started calculating. Vincent Caruso's hand moved slowly toward his jacket. How do you know that name? Richard's voice was sharp now, suspicious. Frank smiled. I know a lot of things. Too many things. Paul stood up abruptly. Things you shouldn't know. Things that weren't in any evidence folder. The room went dead quiet. Frank could feel the moment when they all realized something was wrong, when the pieces started clicking into place. Who are you? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. I'm exactly who I said I was. Frank Torrino, retired detective. Bullshit. Vincent was on his feet now. No retired detective knows about Joey Martinez's harness. That was never reported. Never investigated. Or Danny O'Brien's crane, Richard added, his face pale. The hydraulics were fixed before the cops even arrived. Paul was backing toward the door. This is a setup. This whole thing is a setup. Sit down, Paul. No, I'm leaving. Right now. Paul grabbed the door handle. Twisted. Nothing. It's locked. The door is locked. Panic rippled through the room like a shock wave. Let us out. Sarah was on her feet, pounding on the door. Let us out right now. Nobody's going anywhere. Frank's voice cut through the chaos. Vincent had his hand inside his jacket now. You're wearing a wire, aren't you? You son of a bitch, you're wearing a wire. Vincent, don't. Antonio Torrino spoke for the first time, his voice calm but commanding. He's a cop, Tony. He's been playing us this whole time. I know what he is. Frank touched his ear, adjusting the device. The gesture that had looked innocent before now seemed sinister, threatening. That's not a hearing aid, Richard breathed. That's a transmitter. Very good, Richard. The room erupted, chairs scraping against the floor, voices raised in panic and rage. Paul was throwing his shoulder against the door. Sarah was screaming about lawyers. Richard was shouting about entrapment. But Vincent was moving toward Frank, his hand emerging from his jacket with something metallic. I wouldn't. Frank's voice was ice. You're dead, cop. You're fucking dead. Vincent, stop. Antonio's command cracked like a whip. But Vincent was beyond listening. 2 years of paranoia and violence had wound him too tight. He lunged forward, the knife glinting under the fluorescent lights. Frank moved like he'd been doing this for 40 years, because he had. The knife went wide. Vincent hit the table hard. The evidence photos scattered across the floor. Federal agents! The voice boomed from outside the door. This is the FBI. Oh God, Sarah moaned. Oh God, oh God, oh God. How long? Antonio's voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath. How long have you been undercover? 2 years. 2 years. Antonio nodded slowly. The Torrino family. You were inside the Torrino family. I was your nephew's best friend. I was at your dinner table. I was in your meetings. I heard every order you gave. Paul was hyperventilating now. The trial, the whole trial. It was fake, wasn't it? The judge was Agent Martinez. The lawyers were federal prosecutors. Even Tommy Castellano was one of ours. You bastard. Richard's face was purple with rage. You lying bastard. Marcus Webb isn't dead, is he? Sarah's voice was hollow. Alive and well, under federal protection. His testimony is already recorded. The pounding on the door was getting louder, more urgent. Open up! FBI. They're not coming in until I give the signal, Frank said. Until I'm satisfied we have everything we need. What do you want? Antonio asked. I want you to tell me about the others, the ones we haven't found yet, the judges you've bought, the inspectors on your payroll, the politicians who look the other way. Go to hell. Vincent, tell me about the other workers you killed, the ones we don't know about yet. Vincent was bleeding from where he'd hit the table. I'm not saying anything without a lawyer. Paul, tell me about the other witnesses you've silenced, the other people you've paid to forget what they saw. I want immunity. I want a deal. Sarah, tell me about the other companies, the other construction sites where people are dying. I'll tell you everything. Just get me protection. They'll kill me if they find out I talked. Richard, tell me about the city contracts, the bribes, the officials who rubber stamp your permits. This is entrapment. This whole thing is illegal. Frank stood up slowly, walked to the center of the room, looked at each of them in turn. You want to know what's illegal? Killing workers who try to report safety violations, bribing inspectors to ignore code violations, threatening families who ask questions about how their loved ones died. The pounding on the door was constant now, rhythmic, professional. You want to know what's illegal? Running a criminal organization that's killed dozens of people and corrupted an entire industry. Frank touched his earpiece. This is Torrino. We're ready. The door exploded inward. Federal agents flooded the room like a black tide. Tactical gear, weapons drawn, voices shouting commands. FBI, get on the ground! Now! Hands where we can see them. Don't move! Nobody move. The room became a chaos of bodies and shouting. Paul was on the floor, hands behind his head, sobbing. Sarah was screaming about protection and deals. Richard was demanding his lawyer. Vincent was trying to stanch the bleeding from his forehead. But Antonio Torrino just sat in his chair, hands folded, watching Frank with calculating eyes. 2 years, he said again, his voice somehow audible above the chaos. You're good, Frank. I'll give you that. Not good enough to save your family. My family will survive. We always do. Not this time. Agent Rodriguez appeared at Frank's shoulder. You okay? I'm fine. Vincent had a knife? He's not very good with it. Rodriguez surveyed the room. Federal agents were cuffing the conspirators, reading them their rights, documenting everything. Good work, Frank. 2 years of this. I don't know how you did it. Frank pulled the earpiece from his ear, set it on the table. Neither do I. As they led Antonio Torrino away in handcuffs, he looked back at Frank one last time. This isn't over. Yeah, it is. But Frank knew better. There would be others. There always were. People who thought they could buy their way out of consequences, who believed power was the only truth that mattered. The room emptied slowly. Evidence was bagged and tagged. Statements were taken. The elaborate deception that had been necessary to bring down a criminal organization was finally coming to an end. Frank walked to the window, looked down at the street below. Federal agents were loading the conspirators into unmarked vans. In a few hours, the fake courthouse would be dismantled. The actors would go back to their real jobs. The evidence would be processed and filed. But the construction workers who'd died would still be dead. The families who'd lost loved ones would still be grieving. The system that had allowed this to happen would still be broken. You know what bothers me most, Frank said to Rodriguez. What's that? How close they came to walking away, if Vincent hadn't panicked. If they'd just kept their mouths shut and demanded lawyers. But they didn't. They broke. They all broke. Frank nodded. This time. His phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. You should have taken the money. Frank showed it to Rodriguez. She made a note, probably to trace the number. But Frank knew it wouldn't lead anywhere. There were always more of them. Always another layer to the conspiracy. He deleted the message, straightened his tie. The fake hearing aid sat on the table where he'd left it. 2 years of his life reduced to a small electronic device. 2 years of pretending to be someone else. 2 years of watching people die while he gathered evidence. Frank drove through the city streets, past the construction sites where men like Marcus Webb risked their lives for honest pay, past the courthouses where justice was supposed to be blind, but too often had its hand out. He thought about the phone call he'd have to make, to the real families of the dead workers, to tell them that their loved ones' killers had been caught, that justice, however delayed, had finally come. It wasn't much, but it was something. Thanks for listening to one very short story. If today's story hooked you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us grow and keeps the suspense coming your way. Want to dive deeper? Check out the podcast description to learn more about the show and explore special offers from our sponsor. Until next time, keep dodging bullets and stay safe in the shadows.